The Experiment Publishing is distributed by Workman. The Experiment is an independent publisher founded in 2008, specializing in a wide variety of nonfiction titles, and cannot be more excited to have you and Adam here. So over to you.
All right. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer. I just wanted to take a few minutes to introduce our guest tonight, Adam Rutherford. He is joining us from the UK. Many of you have probably sold Adam's books before, but for those of you who might not be familiar, I wanted to do a little intro. So Adam is a geneticist, a best-selling science writer, and a broadcaster. He writes for the science pages of The Guardian, and he's also written and hosted several award-winning series and programs for the BBC, including their flagship weekly Radio 4 program, Inside Science. Adam is the author of 4 books now: Creation, which was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which was a National Book Critics Circle nonfiction finalist, and most recently, The Book of Humans, which was just released in paperback back in May. So the book that we're going to be talking about today is How to Argue with a Racist, his 4th book. It's already a bestseller in the UK, and the US spring publication was delayed, as many were, due to coronavirus, something that has obviously drastically affected our world of book selling and how each of you are doing your businesses, handling your businesses. But the events of recent weeks have proven just how necessary it is to have this specific book out for readers right now. So the book has been updated to speak to both coronavirus and the events following George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's now going to publish on August 11th. You can download the full updated book on Edelweiss for anyone who's interested in a DRC. Just again, I really can't stress how important this book is and how more necessary than ever it is as we face issues of race and the discussions are becoming more prominent in our daily lives. It's really vital that we understand the science and the facts as we have those discussions. Even the most well-intentioned misunderstandings can be racist and can be damaging. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam, who's going to speak to the book's message. He's going to talk a little bit about the updates made to take into account the recent events and what we should all take away from the book in this event to be fully equipped to deal with racist arguments in the future. All right, over to Adam.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for coming. I almost don't need to add anything after that excellent summary, so maybe Jennifer could just do this talk instead. So this is my 3rd book with The Experiment, and I'm just super grateful that even in the current situation, we have the opportunity to talk directly to booksellers, to independent booksellers as well, who are so much the sort of beating heart of getting our books out there. So thank you all for coming along. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm a geneticist, and what geneticists study is human variation and human evolution, and that's the sort of core of my work. Not just as a researcher, but also as a science communicator. And as Jennifer alluded to, there's, well, the sort of necessity, my compulsion to write this book, it emerged out of some areas of science that I've been writing about for years, including in A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which was my last book, book 1, where I talk about, I've got a chapter on race and eugenics. But the genesis of this book was to massively expand upon that and really go in depth into the history and the concepts of race and the stereotypes associated with race, specifically dealing with them from a scientific point of view, from my point of view as a geneticist. And there's a number of reasons for that. So there's a sort of 3-way clash of 3 aspects of my own sort of history. The first is, as I said, I'm a geneticist and we study human variation. The second thing is that I'm a geneticist at UCL, at University College London, in the genetics department, which was until the 1960s, it was called the eugenics department. And in many ways, in many very real ways, the foundations of eugenics and the scientific bolstering of race science occurred in the labs that I was an undergraduate in and still am a research fellow in to this day. So there's a very particular history that comes from being at UCL and studying genetics, which I am very much part of. And the third reason is, well, I'm mixed race. I'm my dad is from Yorkshire in the north of England, and my mother is Indian via Guyana. And so I have experienced a limited degree of racism in this country, but it is part of those three things combined form this sort of triumvirate where there just felt like such a necessity to write this at this time, and compounded by the fact that, as Jennifer alluded to, conversations about race have become more prominent and have come to dominate the public discourse in very serious ways in the last few months in particular. And there was one other factor as well, which was part of the motivation for writing this book, which is that I am a science communicator. So my job is to act as a conduit between researchers and some pretty technical and hard science and the rest of the world, the publics. And what I discovered, what I found in the last few years in giving public lectures and talking about my books and my work on the radio and on TV and in front of live audiences, that there was quite a significant disconnect between what we think and understand to be correct within human genetics, within the academy, not just at UCL, but at universities all around the world, where I've got many, many close colleagues and friends, and particularly in the States. And the conversations we were having were significantly different from the conversations that I was experiencing in the public domain. And one of the reasons that I loved giving public talks so much is that you get to test ideas. You get to talk about ideas that we research in a scientific setting, which can be very ivory tower and very technical and doesn't engage with the public. And so in talking to the public, I wanted to experience what other people thought. And I found this disconnect that the way we talk about science in the academy is significantly different from the way many people in the public understand human variation and concepts of race. Primarily that race is not a biological category at all. It is a social category, categorization. And what we mean by that is that when we understand human diversity and human evolution, human variation at a genetic level, it doesn't correlate with the colloquial uses of racial terms that we're all familiar with. So for that reason, we refer to it as a social construct rather than a biological one. Now, that is a very uncontroversial thing to say if you're a geneticist. That is a statement which would raise no eyebrows talking to pretty much every geneticist and anthropologist and most biologists on Earth today. And yet, when talking to different publics, we find that that is not necessarily what many people think. So basically, the book is about how my science cannot be used to defend bigotry, to defend racial bigotry, even though the genesis of human biology, of human genetics, of anthropology is inextricably entwined with the developments in the last few hundred years only of the racial categories that we're familiar with. So this is a science. My science is the evolutionary descendant of pseudoscience that was co-opted, invented, and marshaled into defending political ideologies primarily associated with European expansionism. So that's the sort of overall pitch of what the book is. I want to be able to talk about this to you guys in a very relaxed and easygoing way. So I didn't want to give you like a formal presentation. I have many lectures based around this, both for publics and for academics and for undergraduates that I teach at UCL. But I thought for you guys, I think it's more useful for me to talk to you like this, without notes, and to get to questions as soon as we can. So I'll just condense what I'm going to say. There are 4 chapters, so it's a deliberately concise book. It's about 50,000 words. And the 4 chapters are the history of race, because things I was just talking about, the racial categories that we use today are just remarkably modern in their genesis. They really only are founded in the 17th century onwards, mostly by Europeans, many in London, many in Germany, and very closely associated with European expansionism, colonialism, the age of, well, the way I describe it in the book is that we call this era the scientific revolution, or the age of enlightenment, but it is also the age of plunder and exploitation. So chapter 1 is about the invention of race, which is primarily predicated on our understanding of pigmentation, which has radically changed in only the last 5 years. So the concepts of pigmentation, which was the primary way in which the racial categories of the last few hundred years were designed and invented, actually turn out to be genetically incoherent and not valid. But we've really only discovered that using genetics in the last few years, because we did something that we've never done before, which was to actually study the genetics and the molecular biology and pigmentation with and of people in Africa. Really hasn't happened until the last few years, which is just an amazing fact. The second chapter is on the concepts of ancestral purity. So this has been interesting, because in the last few years as well, there's been an amazing rise in sorry, just checking my mute there. There's been an amazing acceleration in the understanding of genetics from an academic point of view by my colleagues and friends and people I read. But at the same time, something we didn't predict is the astonishing rise of commercial ancestry testing kits, so companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, of which tens of millions have been sold. Genealogy is the second most popular pastime in the UK. The first is gardening, and it is the most popular pastime in America. And what this has done, I argue in the book, is reinforce some ideas about sort of genetic essentialism, about inbuilt or ingrained characteristics that come with ancestry, which we don't think in the genetics community are useful or true or accurate, but they are very, very appealing. They're particularly appealing to white supremacists who are necessarily obsessed with concepts of racial purity, which are non-scientific and an absolute nonsense. Now, that's the second chapter. And within that, I talk a lot about the Americas, because a lot of this is best understood through the story of the transatlantic slave trade during the last couple of 401 years it is now. And so that is particularly honed towards, well, it's not for an American audience, it's for a global audience, but it is about African Americans and their ancestry, which is peculiar compared to anywhere else on earth because of the pernicious nature of that trade. Now, one thing that I want to stress is that arguing with white supremacists and neo-Nazis, I think, is a lot less productive and, in fact, in some ways less interesting than talking to people who are not overt racists, just normal, everyday people who may harbor stereotyped views or outdated or old-fashioned concepts of race, whilst not actually being racist themselves. And I guess a key purpose of the book is to try and disabuse people of those stereotypes and demonstrate that science doesn't support them. And the third chapter is about sport. And I recognize that not everyone is into sport, although I am. But one of the points of having this is that I think that sport is, even if you're not into sport, sport is one of the ways that both traditionally and today, we see the people of the world at the extremes of ability. And therefore it's very easy to associate specific characteristics with specific groups of ancestral populations. And the examples I'm going to talk about, the ongoing excellence and dominance of East Africans in long distance running, notably Kenyans and Ethiopians, and the absolute dominance since 1980 in short distance sprinting in the Olympics. There hasn't been a white man in the final of the Olympics since 1980. There's some other examples I go into in great detail, such as the equivalent absence of African Americans in swimming, and not just African Americans, but Africans and people of recent African descent, of which there have only been 2 in the history of swimming events in the Olympics. And then the final chapter is on probably, well, I think definitely the most controversial subject in the whole of science, which is the association between race, intelligence, and ancestry. And that is some pretty controversial ideas. There's so much debate about this continuously, although I argue that this is a cultural phenomenon which is not occupied or not supported by geneticists, who are really significantly the only scientists who truly are engaged in this type of understanding. And yet there is a sort of culture war about intelligence and race and IQ, which is ongoing and geneticists need to engage with this as well as the publics, because there is an absence of their voice. Often scientists are reluctant to talk about these sorts of issues. We're sort of coached as scientists to say, these are the data, society, everyone else can deal with the repercussions of them. And in the book, I argue that that is not good enough. As with other issues such as climate, the data is fairly unequivocal. These are non-controversial issues within science. And therefore, I think scientists need to get better at standing up and saying, you can't have my tools to argue for your bigotry. So those are the 4 chapters. Now, it was published in the UK in February, and I had about 5 or 6 weeks of clear time lecturing and doing media and writing articles and touring, and then this happened. COVID struck, and I got hit pretty bad. I was almost hospitalized, but I also got pneumonia, and then it turned into a global pandemic, and the whole world turned upside down. And then in May there was the killing of George Floyd, of course, and the demonstrations and the riots that followed in America and also all over the world. And as Jennifer alluded to at the beginning, we sort of vacillated on when to publish this book. And then once the Black Lives Matter demonstrations had happened, that we just felt compelled that this book needs to be out there as soon as possible. And obviously Black Lives Matter is a racial issue and has come to dominate, has caused race to be absolutely top of the headlines all around the world. But COVID as well is also, was immediately racialized in 2 specific and discrete ways. And I've written a new introduction, so a new sort of 2,000 words to go at the front of the US book. So this will be exclusive to the US markets, although we may adopt it in the international markets subsequently, which talks about Black Lives Matters and the George Floyd killing, but also is about the racialization of COVID. The 2 discrete ways, which I think are important to discuss, are, well, the first one is that the origin of the virus, as we think best, because it still hasn't been absolutely confirmed, occurred in the Wuhan fish markets, wet market, probably at the end of 2019. And its origin in China meant that immediately the racialization of this as an origin and the use of this, the weaponization of its origin, became so prominent that, well, now that there is there's a Wikipedia page dedicated to documenting the thousands of racial attacks, and including violent racial attacks and terrorist plots associated with COVID, which in the Americas, there's been several thousand documented, which relatively indiscriminately target both Koreans and Korean Americans and Chinese American citizens. And this is happening here in the UK too. On the street where I work, a student at my own university was beaten back in February, with the assailants shouting, "Your COVID is not welcome here," or racist words to those effect. And this hasn't been helped at all by the behavior, by the actions, and notably the words of President Trump, who has repeatedly and unapologetically referred to the disease in racialized terms. So these are some of the things that I try to deal with in this new introduction. The second way that COVID has been racialized is, I'm sure you're aware that infection rates and death rates in minorities, so in the UK, that's primarily Black and Asian people, and in the US, it's Black, Asian, and Hispanic Latino people. Those groups are significantly at higher risk of infection and death. Now, again, that was immediately racialized, and as soon as these data started coming in, I started, not alone, but I started, because of my conversations in public are often about race, I started getting a lot of correspondence from people saying, well, doesn't this show that race is a biological category and is not a social category, because these groups of people are suffering at a higher rate? To which the answer is a categorical no, for a number of reasons, which I go into, but crucially, well, we don't group those people together in one racial category, even if you are the most ardent racist. All that does is say white people and other people, and I think you have to be a special type of racist to think like that. But more importantly, several biological theories have been proposed, some of which are reasonable, some of which may turn out to have some basis in biology. But more important than all of that, the trying to explain the disparity in these infection and death rates using molecular biology or genetics in a very speculative way is far less fruitful than the fact that all disease and all medical intervention are racialized in the West, and particularly in the UK and particularly in the States, by fact that they are socioeconomic disparities at the root of the racialization of medicine. And we know that very well. That's been studied for decades. And for example, it includes, for infectious disease, it includes phenomena such as groups of people living in close proximity to each other, often in urban centers, often in multi-generational families, where older people who are more susceptible to infection are living next to younger people, and so on. These are all very well documented, very well understood socioeconomic factors which racialize all medicine, not just COVID. And the fact that people started immediately saying, well, is there a biological racial basis to the disparities that we're seeing, is not correct, and is a diversion from what we should be thinking about in this very serious pandemic. So all of that is updated in the new book. And the joke I make to Americans is that the American version of this book is not simply my editor Nick changing all of the references to soccer rather than football, because of course football is a round ball that we kick into goals and not the funny egg-shaped thing that you guys do. It's much more serious than that, and my love of American sport is now in that book rather than talking about English sport. So that's the book. Now, before I hand over to you guys, I just want to say another thing, which is that because I've been talking about these issues for a few months now, and the book for a few months in the UK, I've had some very interesting experiences, and this is a obviously provocative title, and it's a provocative book, and I'm pugnacious when it comes to talking in public. But it's been a learning experience for me in terms of the sensitivity of language and what you can talk about reasonably and how people will react. And so one of the things that happened quite early on is I had made, in a lecture in Bristol, Bristol was the center of the slave trade in the UK. And the majority of my audiences are white. But at one particular lecture in Bristol, I was talking about white supremacists, and I was not lighthearted, but I was mocking them because they're ridiculous, awful, hateful people. And it's easy to mock them because their understanding of science is so absurd that it deserves contempt. And the audience chuckle along, and then I talk about some more serious aspects of the science. Now, after one event, a black lady came up to me and said, and she said this very positively, she wasn't angry, but she said, I need to tell you this, that when you talk about white supremacists like that, and you laugh, and the audience laughs, I find it that uncomfortable, because I don't think it's funny, and it is an expression of your privilege that that you have the capability to laugh at these awful people, because it is not your ancestors or your family that are targeted or were murdered or by these people. And she said that in a way which changed my thinking. It was one of those moments where you always have to recognize your own privilege and modify your own behavior as a result of that. Another thing that we have talked about a lot, and we've changed for this edition compared to the UK edition, is some of the language in reference to how we actually talk about different races. And we took the editorial decision to capitalize colors when referencing groups of people. So black is capitalized throughout the book, and I note this in the preface, saying this is not just a typographical choice. This is a reflection of a change in culture around this, and it's not universal, but I think that it is the right thing to do at this stage. And another thing that has happened in talking to audiences is just recognizing that this is a subject which is personal and controversially so. And so language like how you even talk about specific groups of people. So on consecutive nights, I did lectures back in February. And one night, a young black woman said, I think I'd been using the term people of color, POC, or women of color. And a young black woman said, I just wanted to say, thank you, but I want to reclaim black. I'm a black woman. That's what I want to be referred to as. So that's just, have that from me. And the very next night, having referred to black women, a black person said, I would referred to as people of color. So I think the conclusion to that is just for me to be sensitive about that, to listen to people's personal views, because obviously there is a huge range of views within this complex field. And I think the only way to deal with this is to not be indignant, but to listen and be sensitive. And I think that, my understanding talking to booksellers here, my wife is an editor, is that these are the types of questions that people might ask when, there's a lot of race books around at the moment, which is a great thing. And I think mine is possibly not unique, but it's unusual in that it comes from a very scientific point of view rather than a cultural point of view, or even a historical point of view, although there's lots of history in there. But the key idea is to equip people so that they have the robust scientific arguments that we in the academy have not been talking about outside of the walls of the academy, but believe to be true for years, but that when conversations about race emerge in the public eye, where these sorts of stereotypes exist, often positive attribute stereotypes, such as, people who want to be faster runners, or you say, well, Jewish people are more intelligent, who wouldn't want that? But one of the things I want to do is to explain, A, why those stereotypes are wrong, and B, why they are still damaging, and give the book is to give people the tools to answer those sorts of questions. So I have been talking for half an hour now, and I think I've said most of the things that I thought were useful. So maybe I'll hand it over to you guys and see if you have any questions. I can talk about this for about 24 hours without breathing, so it's probably best if I stop right now.
So let's everybody turn on your cameras and your mics, and let's ask some questions. Everyone's so quiet.
So I would actually like to start. Adam, obviously I've read this book and I've talked with you about this before, but one of the parts that I find every time to be more and more fascinating are what are some examples of the more common statements and beliefs that you've encountered with the public that are in fact well-intentioned and people just simply aren't realizing that it's actually a racist viewpoint.
Yeah, sure. So I'll briefly talk about sport here, and maybe I'll just touch on intelligence, which is a pretty complex subject, but worth tapping into briefly. So the thing I mentioned about 100 meters. If you're interested in sport, if you've watched the 100 meters sprint in the final of the Olympics, which I think is one of the most viewed, something like 2 billion people watch that. I very confidently wrote in the published version in the UK that the winner of the 100 meters in Tokyo in 2020 would be a person of recent African descent. That is now corrected and now says the winner of the delayed 2020 Olympics, whenever they might happen, will be a person of recent African American descent. And so the idea then becomes, well, because of 40 years worth of absolute dominance in this one particular race, which is the sort of official version of the fastest humans can go, because there haven't been any non-recent African descended people in the last 40 years, it seems like a data set from which you can draw a conclusion that, well, people of recent African descent seem to be genetically or biologically predisposed to being good at short distance or sprint sport. And then a further argument that is often used to support this is to say that the reason for this is that over 400 years worth of slavery, well, not quite 400 years, but during the slave period, that the people of West Africa who were enslaved and their descendants were effectively selected for power and explosive energies. And therefore, this seems like a reasonable hypothesis to explain the data that we all see, which is the dominance of African Americans and Caribbeans and African Canadians in this one particular race. And so you go, well, I'm not being, so people say, I'm not being racist here, but this there hasn't been a white man in this, and slavery seems like a reasonable hypothesis to support this position. Well, yes, the problem with that is none of those things are correct. And it doesn't take much unpicking, both scientifically or sort of culturally or historically, to realize why that is the case. From a scientific point of view, we can see evidence of selection, natural selection or artificial selection in this case, in the human genome. This is a relatively recent phenomenon within genetics, but we can look at genomes and say, yes, this bit of the genome, it has been selected for whatever reason. And the truth of the matter is that if you compare the genomes of African Americans to European Americans or European descended Americans, there is no evidence of selection for anything at all. They are different and measurably different, but we don't see any positive selection under a sort of Darwinian model at all. So that idea just falls by the wayside just by looking. And this is one of the sort of themes of all of my work, which is that people are attracted to common sense arguments. That's just obviously true. And one of the things I say in the book is that actually science is the opposite of common sense, because it is there to get over our prejudices, our baggage, our historical misconceptions and biases that we all have because we're humans. What science is meant to do is to just get rid of all that and try and address what is actually correct. And that is one example of that. There just is no evidence for that. This is a sort of personal anecdote that's in the book there. It was particularly galling for me because I'm a big fan of track and field, and Michael Johnson is my favorite athlete of all time. I'm 45, so I was in my formative years when he was at the absolute peak of his abilities in the 200 and the 400. And so in the 2012 Olympics, which was in London, just over there, he was part of the commentating team. And just before they launched, before the beginning of the Olympics, they had a documentary on him, which is wonderful for me. And they did some ancestry testing on him, which was a bit earlier than, it's not as advanced as it is now with the commercial tests that you can get. But during the course of this program, they showed, well, I think rather dubiously, that his West African ancestry meant unequivocally that he was descended from the enslaved, which is entirely unsurprising. But he then made that statement in this program and said that I used to think that my successes in athletics were as a result of my hard work and my work ethic and my training. But it's impossible, I'm paraphrasing now, the quote is in the book, but it's impossible to think that my ancestry, my slave ancestors, my enslaved ancestors are not part of my success. I remember him saying that, watching it in 2012 and just going, no, dude, no, please don't you be thinking that, because you're undermining your own greatness with pseudoscience, with information which is ahistorical and scientifically inaccurate. So I've written to Michael Johnson with a copy of the book, and hope that he might see that and take some credit for his own success rather than unearned auspicious ancestry, which is just not scientifically incorrect. So that's one very specific example. There are lots of other examples about, so I talk a little bit about, stereotypes about natural abilities, such as with music, when people talk about African Americans being naturally musical, or Jewish people being better at intellectual pursuits, and by extension better with financial pursuits. And all of these things are both biologically inexplicable, culturally totally explicable, and historically untrue. And again, they refer to this sort of phenomenon which we call positive attribute racism. But the reason positive attribute racism is still racism and is still pernicious, is still damaging, is because, for example, in the case of African Americans, all of those stereotypes tend to do one specific thing, which is to value physicality over intellectuality, to reinforce a completely nonsensical idea that they are closer to nature, that Africans are somehow less evolved. I mean, this is the actual language used by both white supremacists and more well-intentioned people. That one of the examples I give is that Jesse Owens' coach, a guy called Dean Cromwell, said exactly this after Jesse Owens got the 4 golds at the 1936 Olympics. He said, well, it wasn't that long ago that Owen's ancestors had to run away from lions in the jungle. And you think, that's just painful to hear. That's one example. That's and the other one is that I go into in some detail, is that the idea that based on some pretty robust data, that Jewish people have a disproportionate level of success, particularly Ashkenazi Jewish people, and particularly Ashkenazi Jewish people in the States, have a disproportionate level of success in academic pursuits, in things like Nobel Prizes, in the sciences, in being lead violinists and conductors in major orchestras, and a few other chess grandmasters, and so on. And again, you might say, well, who doesn't want that? This is not a negative thing to say. Who doesn't want to be better at all those pursuits? The problem with it is that to base that in biology is biologically incorrect, that there is no evidence to support that whatsoever. There's been a lot of attempts in the last few years by people whose motivations are difficult to unpick without concluding that they have racist motivations, but that's an accusation which has to be carefully sort of moderated in my language. But those ideas which are biologically incorrect, as I say, and culturally explicable, are also exactly, precisely the same arguments used in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s in Western Europe, and particularly in Germany. And so both of those examples, and there are others, because I don't just focus on African Americans, I just don't focus on Jews. Both of those arguments are really robust examples of how these stereotypes, regardless of how positive they sound, or how they reflect attributes which are possibly desirable, how they are incorrect and reinforce age-old stereotypes which are unequivocally racist and are so baked into our culture that we sort of don't realize. Many well-intentioned people who aren't overt racists don't realize quite the significance of repeating things. So again, the book is a weapon to try and disarm the use of those sorts of stereotypes to actually perpetrate what are unequivocally racist sentiments. That was a long answer, wasn't it? It's gone quiet again.
It has. I think there's a. Oh, the comment is good answer though. So. Is another question? I'm really liking the answers. So.
Just looking at my notes.
I have a question. Oops.
There you are.
Me, Paula. My video's not on though.
This is Paula Farmer from Book Passage.
Hi. Not to make too fine a point of your exact title of the book, but How to Argue with a Racist. But in general, sometimes it seems like even trying to intellectually debate or emotionally engage in someone who seemingly is a racist or is blatantly a racist seems as futile as, trying to make sense with someone who's drunk. And I was just wondering, is there a good way to broach these conversations, especially as the minority talking to, the racist, and not necessarily a white person talking to another a white racist or something?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously the title is deliberately provocative. And some of the actual racists who've reviewed my book have said this isn't how to argue with a racist at all. I don't know what they were expecting. And there is, the culture, the sort of debate me culture, that a lot of people call me out for that and say, well, when have you actually debated with a racist? And the way I respond to that is, well, twofold. One is, looks better on your CV than it does on mine. I'm not sure. I've written the book. Where you give me your book, and then we can talk. And the second thing is, I'm not really into performative debating. There's the great Jonathan Swift maxim, which I will paraphrase because I can't remember the 17th century phrasing, which is that you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And that's really important. And that is why, I mentioned this earlier, that is why I think that the white supremacists, which I do talk about in the book, are less important as part of this conversation than normal people, non-white supremacists, people who aren't overt racists, but still might hold these views. Part of the reason why why this became a book was a lot of people were talking to me and saying, after articles I'd written or lectures I'd given, I wish I'd had this at Christmas or Thanksgiving when I visit my parents or at family parties, because these conversations seem to be coming up more and more. And I intuitively knew that this was not correct, or I'd heard people say that one of these stereotypes was not correct, but I didn't actually have the tools to say to my uncle, no, that's not why African Americans have dominated in this race, or that's not why there are more Jewish chess grandmasters than any other ethnic or cultural category. So that's one aspect to this answer. The second is that this is not a book for white people, right? Although racism is primarily a white people problem. There are many issues in the book which are stereotypes which again appear to be racially neutral but are in fact not. And another one which I think is one of the areas that a lot of this book will make you angry, and that's intentional, and it made me angry writing it, but it also made me feel empowered. And one example which continues to make me very angry is to do with swimming. And I alluded to this earlier. The proportion of African Americans who can swim is significantly lower than European Americans, and that is reflected in the almost complete absence of African Americans in swim competitions, notably in the Olympics. Now, there is a biologized explanation for this, which is that people of African descent have more dense bones than people of European descent. And this is, I don't know whether any of you guys have heard that, but this is a widely held belief. And it is absolute nonsense. It is based on a complete misunderstanding of some actuary data from a couple of papers in the States a few years ago, which was to do with increased levels of osteoporosis in post-mortem African Americans. And somehow this got translated and racialized by racists into African Americans have more dense bones, and therefore they sink, right? So they're less buoyant than Europeans and white-skinned people. Now, it's as absurd as it sounds, but the reason I bring this up now is that this is a commonly held belief by Black people. And I have friends who think it. I've got, Black British friends who say and repeat this. And again, I think when I hear this, I think, God, this is so ingrained in our culture. This is such a stereotype that even Black people think this. And it's simply not the case. When Swim America surveyed the reasons why, the top 5 reasons why African Americans are so underrepresented in swimming ability, the top 5 reasons, none of them are biological, all of them are socioeconomic. So it costs money to do after extracurricular swim training. After segregation in '64, most swimming pools were built in predominantly white areas. There are no role models, and role models are incredibly important in sporting or any cultural success. And there are no role models. So that's a cycle that is self-perpetuating. Parents who don't swim don't teach children how to swim, but the number one cause of the lack of swimming representation in African Americans is simply not being taught how to swim. Now, when I say that, I think that's so absurd that it's almost funny, except for the fact that it's really not funny at all, because the death rate from African American children aged between 8 and 14 is 3 times higher than it is for European children. So this is structural racism, societal systemic racism, which is literally lethal at a level 3 times higher. And we don't recognize this, we don't acknowledge this, we give it a fake pseudoscience bullshit genetics answer based on bone density, which is just an absolute nonsense. And when my Black friends tell that to me, I find that, that is a reason to get angry about this. I've gone off on a rant and I can't remember what the question was, therefore I can't remember. Did I answer the question?
Well, I think like Calvin said, your answers are so good, it kind of doesn't matter. But keeping on the sports examples, and not that you have to go deep into this, but it makes me think of the inherent racism with the American football.
Yep.
and I'm not a football person, so I may be wrong here, but as a Black person who's always heard it, that, you know, Black football players aren't smart enough to be quarterbacks.
Yep.
And the NFL is dominated by, white men that are quarterbacks. And it's almost, and everything you're saying, it sounds like it's become so acceptable, chalking this type of racism up to biological things when it's actually social and racial, and it's just easier for people not to deal with the actual issues, just to let it be pervasive in society, and even other Black people or people of color accept it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And football, American football, I mean, is a really good example of this, because I had to do a sort of crash course on American football, because that is a complex game. And I'm a rugby player. In fact, my main sport is cricket, but American football, I understand, is a version of rugby. That was a joke. But yes, you have these incredibly racialized positions. So the running backs all tend to be Black, as fits the stereotype that goes along with the sprinting in the Olympics. The linebackers, interestingly, are 50-50 split between African Americans and white Americans, except for the position of center, which is 75 white to 25 Black. And so these are incredibly racialized positions, for which there is no biological explanation. There is no possible biological explanation. You know, basketball is another great example of a sport which is heavily racialized. For the last 30 years, 3/4 of the players in the NBA have been African American. Sorry, my dog just, he's just gone for a wander. And so the temptation is also to say, this is a clear example of a sport that Black people are better at, except for the fact that for most of the 20th century, the racialized group or cultural ethnic group that were best at basketball were Jewish people, which is the same in boxing as well. But these are completely cultural and not fixed. Not that these are not fixed things through time, but we've got very short-term memories about this. In long distance running, where Kenyans and Ethiopians have dominated since the 1970s, and in the last 10 years, almost absolutely. For the first 40 years of the 20th century, it was Finnish people who absolutely dominated long distance running. They were known as the Flying Finns. And you know, one guy took something like, from memory, it was something like 23 records over the course of, you know, two Olympics and World Championships. Now, the Finns are interesting there, because at exactly the same time that you're having the rise of National Socialism in Germany, and folkish writers were saying that the reason the Finns were so good at long distance running is because they were closer to nature. They needed to sprint through the landscape whilst hunting down elk or deer or whatever this, you know, made up folklore was. But this was done in a very positive way. This was to say how wonderful these Aryan people were. Exactly the same argument is made from a racist point of view, from a negative racist point of view for people of African descent. And so again, these are just they're cultural aspects of effectively white supremacy, but in a sort of small w, small s way, rather than sort of organized white supremacy. It is exactly the same argument presented in support of one group of people and negative about another group of people. So again, this is why I think sport is important, even though people are not, you know, you don't have to be a sports nerd to get the arguments in this chapter. These are things that everyone, that I think resonates with people who are not actually interested in sports, but they're just so culturally significant and so baked into our culture that we just can't avoid them. And the best quarterback in American football is currently having a 4-year break Now, what would the reason for that be? That was another joke for the American football fans.
Very true.
I do have something that came in through the chat. It wonders if you could suggest other titles, academic, general, on this topic in kids' books, and then they offered up a couple specifics with asking for your thoughts. One is The Bell Curve by Murray and Herrnstein, and Shape of the River by Bach, Schulman, and Bowen.
Right, okay, I don't know the second one. I'm not familiar with that. The Bell Curve by Charles Murray and Bernard Herrnstein? No, what was his name? I forget it. So this was I'm sure you guys know this because you're booksellers. So I think it came out in the mid-90s. So when I was doing my PhD, and it was a hugely controversial book. It is. I'm happy to say this. I think that I think it's an incredibly boring book. And if you read it now, 90% of it is just uncontroversial and dull. And about 10% of it is needlessly controversial and wrong. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Charles Murray's most recent book, someone tell me the name of it? Can't remember. But Charles Murray's most recent book, in which he talks specifically about race, as one third of it is, I think it's race, gender, and poverty. Someone check that for me. He makes basically exactly the same arguments, but with new genetic data to reinforce human diversity. Thank you, Jennifer. But he makes exactly the same errors. And in fact, there was a big controversial article he wrote in the promotion of the book earlier this year, I think it was, or maybe the end of last year. And I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, but it might be in the Washington Post, I forget which. And it was sort of comically wrong. Now, I have read the book, and in terms of understanding, in terms of its structure, it's pretty much the same. It's, thank you, yes, gender, race, and class. I'm just checking the notes here. The leaning on new genetic techniques, which are very complex and very derived from statistics and computational biology, stuff that I have to really concentrate to understand, but are easy to misunderstand and are really easy to use to reinforce misguided or misunderstood racialized biology. And that is exactly what he does in that book. They are complex and they are hard. These are serious topics and serious topics within science. And I rely on my colleagues. This is what scientists are trained to do. This is in our DNA, that you go to your colleagues and you say, I don't understand this. You explain this to me. We peer review everything. I peer review all of my books. I test the ideas by publishing them in academic journals with people who are geneticists. And the problem with a lot of these public conversations, especially enhanced by social media, is you've got a lot of people who just are either motivated by inherent racism or inherent biases or straight up bigotry, and they have a superficial understanding of the topics at hand. And I want to, this book, How to Argue with a Racist, is, I have to write a science book because I'm a scientist, and therefore I want people to be able to try and grasp hold of what we actually think about these subjects with the arguments in place, in order that when you get confronted with the Charles Murrays of this world, you can say, I'm sorry, but what you said about polygenic scoring between populations is simply not correct. You haven't argued that using the data that geneticists think is correct. And that's where these conversations are interesting. That's where they take place. There is a whole movement, particularly in the States, but it also happens here, where there are people with high public profiles who talk about these sorts of issues, and I think often they like to frame themselves as being heretical. You can't say this in the academy. We're not allowed to talk about race and intelligence, and yet this is what it says. Well, I find, and I say this in the book, I find it that for heresy, everyone seems to talk about it all the freaking time, and that's not really how heresy works. And people's careers are made and dependent on saying controversial things that they don't understand but are viscerally appealing. And it's our job to contest that. That's, you know, we do the work. This is my research, this is my colleagues' research, this is published, it's non-controversial within my field, and it's our job to step out of our comfort zones and say, no, you cannot have that. That is not correct, no matter how appealing it might be, no matter how common sense it might be, because that's not what science is for. I got a bit stroppy then again, sorry about that.
I think that it's actually a perfect place to end. We can do better. We should be doing better. And I think you've given us a lot to think about as we move forward. So thank you. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your work. And thank you for the generosity of time this evening.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure. And I got a particular fondness for indie bookshops. I'm surrounded by 3 of the best in London within half a mile of here. And that's where about 90% of my disposable income goes. It's an expensive addiction, but it's a good one. If I just turn my, you can probably see that's one of the many shelves. I've got up there. That's, you know, I like living in a library.
Well, and thank you for the support of indies. I think we all have
Thank
friends
you,
over
Adam.
there too.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah. I will remind everybody, Heather put it in the comments, but the next Tri-West program is Meet Irwan, also distributed by Workman, and that is July 23rd at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, and I think it's noon for us here on the West Coast. So again, Jennifer, Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you. And a reminder that DRCs are on Edelweiss for anyone who is interested. So,
grab them.
have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Cheers.
No problem. Thank you all for coming. No, you always.
Thanks, bye.